Welcome to session 12, part 1, the Western Plantation Church. Surprise, it's not Confucianism.
I think that's surprising for most people that we're making this parallel to an ancient Chinese system of thought.
Mm-hmm.
For listeners, maybe we want to summarize what Confucianism is and then kind of explain a little why we think plantation capitalism is like it, or as you said, it's not Confucianism.
And it goes back to the first session of this that we did where we talked about Cain. Can you tell us how this links together?
Oh, yeah. Because in Confucian theory, there's five major relationships that are put in a hierarchical form. And the first one is father and son. And that's what we talked about with Cain, right? Like Cain was the father who named his city after his son and basically tied his son to his livelihood and his defense and his even story and just and innocence and things like that. And so there's a father-son relationship which is important. Husband and wife is second, which is I know we're going to focus most of our time on that. Elder brother and younger brother, old and young, and ruler and ruled. And I want to throw a caveat out there. We are using Confucianism as a comparison point to plantation capitalism in large part because this is somewhat autobiographical for me. And when I, became a Christian, I had to really wrestle through some of the Confucian elements of Japanese culture and how I was raised. How does it fit or not with following Jesus? As an example of, how I thought about father, son, my relationship with my parents, for instance. There's a story where Confucius says this line. The master said, "Observe what a man has in mind to do when his father is living, and then observe what he does when his father is dead." Okay, so and the idea is, if for 3 years he makes no changes to his father's ways, he can be said to be a good son. That's that's like a long time to wait, right? Or have to prove yourself. Like you have
Yeah.
to live your entire life. I have to live my entire life. And then 3 years after my parents die, then someone else can say you've been a good son. So my mom said to me that in Japanese culture, which is influenced by Confucian teaching, in
Mhm.
Japanese culture, there's a saying, and it's like this: a son is not free from his parents until the son dies, right? Like, how would you have answered that? Like, fill in the blank, right? Like, a son is not
Not
free
free
from his
until
parents
ever.
until, and fill in the blank. What would you
Well,
have guessed?
parent dies? No, until you die. It means you're
Right.
never free.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's kind of the point, right?
It is. It is. There's a great paper that we have from the Journal of Pastoral Psychology, and it's called Confucianism and the Lack of Development of the Self Among Korean American Women. So Confucianism has affected Korean society as well. And the phrase, it's very similar to what you said about that. I'm not going to read it in the Korean, but it means no matter who and where the husband is, if you're married to a rooster, the woman should follow the rooster. And if married to a dog, then she should follow the dog.
So I guess a rooster is a good thing.
I don't want to be married to either personally.
Yeah, yeah. So that speaks to the hierarchical kind of vision of a husband and wife, right? Like a wife shouldn't really be independent, independently thinking, like just follow your husband.
Hmm. One of
Wow.
the things that she talks about in this paper, and I encourage people to read the whole paper because we can't really do it justice. She says that she is arguing that Confucianism, and this is a quote, has been a major influence in creating a subordinate role for women in Korea. The societal expectation of women's subordinate role contributes to the arrest and the development of the self in women. The lack of the development of the self among women brings further broken relationships by causing in women grandiosity. low self-esteem,
Grandiosity.
and a pervasive sense of shame. Yes, interesting things to have together: grandiosity, low self-esteem, and shame all at one time.
When you say all in one time, it could be in across a population, but also like in one person in relation to, for example, other women.
Right, right,
Like you feel superior to some and inferior to others, and
right.
that is fascinating.
Right. And so it's a permanent inequality. It's something that can't be overcome. You can't meritocracy yourself out of it by working hard and coming up into a different class or caste. It's, this is where you're stuck forever.
Well, why don't women join forces and overthrow the patriarchy?
So this author goes on to say, quote, for Korean Americans, in addition to the influence of the church, holding hands here, right? Confucianism has been the foundation that has shaped the fabric of their way of thinking. It's not inaccurate to say that Confucianism, an ancient Chinese religion philosophy, has had an influence far more reaching in the minds and life of people in South Korea than any other religion or philosophy. It has been indoctrinated into Korean culture and has had a dominating influence on people's assumption about the nature of different societal relationships. In particular, permanent inequality is a characteristic of the relationship between men and women in society. So it doesn't not play well with the church. They kind of go together.
Right. And especially certain types of church teaching about either gender as a whole or husbands and wives, as a particular relationship, which we're going to get into. It's really important to understand how these things interact. I mean, I think it's striking because Confucius lived, I don't know, 500 years before Jesus. I would think, or I would want to say at first, that of course Jesus heals and redeems the relationship between men and women and husbands and wives. And yet there are all these, at least, examples of when that doesn't seem to happen. And it
Mhm.
really challenges me. Like, what do I think the Bible really says? How come it doesn't get there?
But I sort of think about my old friend John Piper, who always has something to tell you about anything that you want him to tell you about. And if you wonder if you should submit to some man, then he will tell you that yes, you should all the time. And maybe it's like you're not allowed to be a police officer, but you can design the traffic laws so that no man ever has to see you around, but I don't know, like decided where the traffic lights goes or something. Or maybe he tells you that you just need to pray more and be kind and give in to everything he has to do. And maybe one day he'll stop beating you. Just get beaten for a little bit
Oh
and
my gosh.
come around. Right. It's really awful.
Well, it kind of fits with the Confucian teaching of, well, if he's a fox, follow the fox. If he's a dog, you got to follow the dog. I mean,
Mhm.
we think about missionary work and what does it mean to bring Christian faith into another culture. Like if there's already something there that says to wives,
Mhm.
hey, you got to follow your husband into sin, like no matter what, just because you're his wife.
Right.
We would say no. Like there's all kinds of scripture against that. And,
Right.
and yet here we are, right? Like in the Western church,
Mhm.
there are not everyone says this, but there are some strong conservative voices like Piper who basically says, yeah, you basically do that. And it's weird. It's like, really? Even if he breaks campaign finance laws, like if he stiffs his contractors, you're supposed to support that behavior?
Right. Right. Well, and it's even if it's other stuff too. What if your husband is extremely unkind? What if you really need help and you're really tired? I've seen advice to Christian women say, my husband comes home and I've had a baby with a fever and the kids have all been sick and I just couldn't get dinner on the table in time and he's really mad at me. What should I do? And they're like, well, just submit to that. And it's like, that's really beyond the pale, terribly sinful of a man to treat his wife like that. But it does kind of fit if he's the ruler and you're the ruled. John Piper had said there will come probably, and this is via Sheila Gregoire, who does a wonderful job reframing things in a helpful way of what John Piper tries to hurt us with. There will probably come a point where she desires and needs the support of others in this effort to love her harsh husband. But I would earnestly caution her against bad mouthing her husband behind his back with other people. This will almost certainly backfire in a more hopeless situation. And Sheila rewords this and says, there will probably come a point where she desires and needs the support of others in this effort to draw boundaries with her husband. But I would encourage her to tell safe people, especially licensed counselors, the whole truth. This will provide much needed perspective.
Mm,
That's
good.
good advice. He frames somebody asking for help as bad mouthing. If somebody's hurting me, that it's not bad mouthing to say that person's hurting me. That's the truth. If you're afraid of the truth, then I'm so sorry, but you're doing something wrong.
I mean, that's called Matthew 18ing the person, right? Like you're trying to get other people and their perspective and their help, maybe.
Right. Right. We are allowed and ought to protect ourselves from people who are trying to hurt us because we deserve to be helped and because other people who ostensibly are Christians deserve to hear, hey, you're getting this wrong. We need to help you as well.
Go Sheila Gregoire. So I want to make the link then to plantation capitalism and why is it that gender hierarchy, especially like husband and wife hierarchy, which
Mhm.
which we acknowledge like kind of lives in Confucianism too. Like why is that such an important part of plantation capitalism,
Mhm.
and how does Jesus' Jubilee economy reverse that? So long
Yeah.
build up, but and we have to do a little more historical digging. But I I want our listeners to understand, yes, this is really a part of US history and US Christian history. So I'm going to back up into 1628. Yes, the colonial period, because
Mhm.
one of the first settlements in the US was the Massachusetts Bay Company, and it flowed out of a charter signed by King Charles I. And this charter was actually a for-profit company, right? Like it was a for-profit land grant joint stock company with 10 men as the first investors, the first main investors. And they expected a return on their investment from colonizers going over to North America and starting what is now Boston, Massachusetts, and so on.
So it's reminding me of what we said about Virginia. Virginia was a company. Are you telling us Massachusetts was Walmart?
It was, and they were constantly looking for cheap labor, just
Right.
like
So it's sort of like if we went to Canada and we are like, "Welcome to Canada. It's not Canada. This is now Burger King." And you're like, "No, Canada can't be Burger King." They're like, "Yeah, it is. It is."
right, we're franchising this. This is
Right.
now our real estate.
Right.
And what they did was, okay, if you're on the English side of things and you're like promising land to settlers, and you're trying to make this really attractive to people because it's like, who in their right mind is going to go across an ocean? Like that's by itself, that's really dangerous.
On a wooden that's terrible. I would never do that. Yep. Say no more. Terrible. Keep going.
Right. I mean, the food gets old real fast on that ship. Most people get sick, just
Oh,
and
yeah.
some die, right?
Right.
And then they have to settle in this place that there are already people there, like the Native Americans.
Right.
And and so how does a company incentivize people to take on this
Mhm.
and then give send their profits back to
Right.
investors in right? So
If I said you want to go to Mars, there's no air and you might die. When you get there, can you give me the money you get? What?
right. You'd be like, well, what's in it for me? Okay, so here's what's in it for you. And this is the key to plantation capitalism. Number one, you get the land. Okay. I know.
If you live,
If you live and if the natives don't fight you for it,
right.
so because it's theirs, but
Whose land do
oh,
you
oh,
get? Right.
Okay, you get the land
Mm.
because the king says so. And then you get a 7-year monopoly on trade with old England. So like you can make stuff and then you get to sell that stuff back here at home in England.
Hmm.
So okay, John Winthrop was selected to be the first governor, and then Christian faith was written into the charter to help with the corporate profit making. Here's a quote: harmonious and consensual religious practice was also paramount to peaceful, productive life in the settlement because the investors relied on its values and rhythms to structure communal living and discipline workers. They scheduled daily religious exercise within the households. Here's the key here on the husband's power, where the chief in the family should be, quote, grounded in religion and given the responsibility of housing and supervising servants. Weekly Sabbath was also to be enforced every Saturday throughout the year at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in preparation for sermons and prayers the next day, as the minister shall direct. Sabbath was the only time in the week when all that inhabit the plantation, both for the general and particular employment, may cease their labor. Religious practice led by clergy and enforced by political leaders, but essentially it's a hierarchy and it presses into every household, right? And every man, every husband was and father is supposed to be in charge of the household. That is exactly like Confucian China and other Confucian
Hmm.
societies where the family is a microcosm of the state and actually an expression of the state.
Hmm. It only really works if stuff is being enforced.
Well, exactly.
Right. And so
Exactly.
the king was like, "Hey guys, do you want to be a king like me?" And they're like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Well, you can't be the king of me. That's silly. I'm the king, but you can be the king of other people. I'm going to let you go somewhere where you can have the land." And they're like, "Do you own land?" He's like, "No, other people do, but you can have the land and you can be the king of little pieces of the land. Do you want that? We're going to make it so they all listen to you in a police state." And some guys are like, "Yeah, I don't want that."
Right. And so, I think the incentive for men, for husbands,
Mm,
is kind of obvious, right? It's like you get to be the king of your own little castle.
right.
You get to abuse your wife,
Hmm.
and hopefully you're attracted to her so you could have sex whenever you want. And no one's ever going to question that and the nature of your relationship. And we'll get to that later. You get to just boss your kids around, servants around.
Yeah.
And sure, you're taking on some risks, but at least you'll feel like you're more empowered in the home.
Sounds like this is a for-profit corporate growth strategy to attract some men at the expense of women, other men,
Yeah,
people who were enslaved, that sort of thing.
yeah, that's right. Why
And
don't
that
we
is,
teach US history like this, right? Like,
I don't think I learned this in school.
I learned that it was just it was a religious enterprise, right? These Puritans were trying to find a place to practice their freedom of religion.
They
And
were so pure, it's in the name. Puritans.
this in
Mhm.
but no, this was a for-profit company
Right.
where they twisted Christian faith to make it into a political order, right? Like that served the company profit, the
Right.
bottom line. This comes back to the experience of women and how do women then adjust to a system like that?
Mm-hmm. Well,
What's
how do you adjust when somebody's like, you were born inferior as a woman, can't get away from that, and the only way that you can have any kind of power, any kind of agency is you marry one of these men. And, king needs a queen.
king needs a queen? Well, yeah, then I guess some women would probably uphold the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Get
And
behind my man.
It's great to be second in charge if you can't be first in charge. I might argue it might be better to be second in charge. I've heard people say things like the woman is the neck that turns the head, which is extremely creepy and a weird way to talk about. I don't know. I married my best friend. I don't want to think about being the neck that turns the head.
Hmm.
If I think of myself as a second in charge queen, then things get weird quickly.
Well, and kind of the power behind the throne, right? Like that, and maybe you can manipulate things so that the head does things the neck wants, the king does things the queen wants, the power behind the throne.
Right. Well, then you get to dehumanize everybody who's number three and number four and number five and anything under number two. I mean, it's better to be two than three, right? So it's sort of like we have the example of Kjirsten Nielsen, who was Trump's Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, and she's talking about people underneath her. Her status is, we're exploding this out to big societal systems now. She says, if anyone wants to quibble about whether or not we should call those people, these are people who come to the United States, animals. Perhaps the quibble should be whether we call them something worse.
She's talking about folks coming up through Mexico to the southern
Right.
border, right?
People, they said these are animals coming, and people were like, hey, they're human beings. She was like, well, don't argue with me. Maybe they should be glad to be called only animals. What? What's worse than animals? Sarah Huckabee Sanders said animals didn't go far enough. Human beings made in God's image. And then these women want to say that they are what, representing Christ while calling human beings animals. That's what this number two, I'm in charge mentality, I can have some of the power leads to today.
Well, by naming Kirsten Nielsen and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, I mean these are powerful women, and yet they seem to be serving a racial hierarchy,
Mhm.
right? They're content to be mistresses of the manor. I mean, they're powerful in their own ways, and or they were in the case of Nielsen. I don't know what she's doing now, but well, if I can't be a white man, then I'll talk like a white man when I can get away with it, right? Like,
Well, that's what being a pick me for the patriarchy is. You sort of do what men would like for you to do. You work in service of what your master would have you do.
well, one more, example of that would be Elise Stefanik, right? I mean,
Mhm.
she's another congresswoman. She put out, after January 6, 2021, she put out the statement, those who stormed the Capitol must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But then in January of 2024, she deleted it because I don't know, she's angling to be Trump's vice presidential pick or something like that. Liz Cheney called her out on Twitter. So, that's how I
Right.
came across it. But yeah, another example.
It's not unusual for Christian women to start to canonize their patriarchal pick me worlds by writing books and telling you exactly how you can serve the man who was ordained by God to be your master. I mean, Debi Pearl has written this book that is not really, not like a New York Times bestseller or anything, but have I bumped up against this stuff very frequently in my life, and as have many other women.
You've said that before. Yeah.
Right, right. She has this part in a section titled Your Divine Calling, right? So ostensibly, God Himself has ordained that I lead, quote, the role of being a perfectly fit helper. And this doesn't make one inferior to the leader. She goes on, in our office, there is an entire staff of workers. Every person in the office spells better than I do. Most know the computer better, and they certainly know finances better. Yet, when I walk into the office, I can tell any one of them what to do and how I want it done, and they are all glad to do my bidding, including the men. My place of authority does not mean I am better. It only means that they are there to help me do my job better. So it's got this colonialist undertone. She's playing a hierarchy while she's singing the praises of gender inequality. She's talking out of both sides of her mouth. She gets to be in charge even of men, but it's her divine calling to be underneath her husband, and that's what most of her book is about, called Created to Be His Helpmeet. It's what I was made for, right?
Oh, right, right. To ascend a labor hierarchy just under a husband.
Right. To be the king, the queen to a king.
Yeah,
She
the mistress
literally
of the
says it.
manor.
That is one of the headings in her book, and something that she says: a king needs a queen. She also says being pitiful, hurt, discouraged, and even sickly is one side of a quote bad marriage coin. She says bubbling cheer goes a long way to maintain or even restore a marriage.
Oh, this is the woman you told me about. Like she wrote letters to a younger woman who discovered her husband was having an affair, and so she was like, "How do I keep this marriage?" Right? Like, is that this is Debi Pearl?
She says, your husband will never be pressured into loving you, even if you are his wife. He will never willingly leave a smiling secretary to come home to a frowning wife. You cannot be pitiful enough to force him to love you. Men do not repent for the sake of an angry, critical wife. You can hold out for repentance and most likely lose your husband, or you can court your husband and win back his favor. Ew, recognize that you are at war for the preservation of God's most noble institution, your family. Make yourself more attractive than the secretary. You can win if you are willing to lose your pride. You must be more lovely than she. You must beat her at her own game. A man is attracted to vulnerability in a woman, the blush, the need, the dependence.
Wait a minute. I mean, I thought that we are supposed to repent because of Jesus,
No,
right?
that's not part of this. It's just all Confucianism. Did you listen to the title?
Oh, yes, right. But and then, to be the mistress of the manor means that there's this competition between her and all other women.
Exactly. Right.
And and we have to think about it that way. Otherwise, we'll never, quote, win.
Right. She also says, earn every smile and shared moment, cultivate his love for you. The tool of your warfare is your loving, kind, delightful, radiant, adoring self. The tool of your warfare, this is not the language of partnership and loving. This is being in a battle against you, against everybody, against your husband, against other women, against the people who work in your office. It's disgusting.
Well, I mean, please go on. There's another quote that
Oh,
I,
yeah.
I think is especially telling.
What regarding, again, this is a man who is actively cheating on her. She says, be creative and aggressive in your private, intimate times. Keep him drained at home so he won't have any sexual need at work. If you feed him well emotionally and sexually, her cooking won't tempt him. God is on your side. Fight and win.
Wow.
It's
I mean,
condescending to men. It's
yes.
demoralizing, humanizing to women.
When you spoke of the neck that turns the head, I mean, this is exactly the kind of manipulative, hide your grief and sadness over his betrayal and just put on a smile, put on lingerie, and it'll be fine. And we'll get to like later what does this do to women's physical voice, like the physical vocalization of their voice. Wow.
Right. Well, another figure in this who's not quite as outwardly gross as Debi Pearl is Phyllis Schlafly. Um, and she who just recently died in 2016. She was born in 1924, so she lived a long life. Um, Author describing her says she sort of landed on the political gold of misogyny in a time when the moral majority and all of the men were trying to do all their political maneuvering to figure out how to get a voting block. And they were like, okay, so we can't do segregation anymore because I guess everybody hates that. So we'll just do abortion now. And that was a whole manipulation. Phyllis Schlafly very shrewdly landed on, you know what everybody loves? Everyone loves a little misogyny, even women. They can hate themselves a lot all the time. And so she was this founder of the Stop ERA movement, which prior to her getting involved was sort of like this no-brainer thing that it was pretty much guaranteed to have bipartisan support. Like women are equal as men and We all cool with that? But then she started this thing. It's called STOP, which is a terrible acronym. Stop taking our privileges.
Wait, you're not supposed to use the same word
I
in the acronym
know.
that it's for.
Like it's a terrible acronym, but stop taking our privileges.
We reject the anti-family goals of the Equal Rights Amendment. The American women do not want abortion. They do not want lesbian privileges, and they do not want universal child care in the hands of the government.
I just took on the whole feminist movement.
One of the first things that the Equal Rights Amendment would do is to invalidate the state laws that make it the obligation of the husband to support his wife. I get fed up with the women's liberationists running down motherhood and saying that it's a menial, degrading career and that the home is a prison from which women should be liberated and brought out into this wonderful workforce.
In one of her books, Phyllis Schlafly says, quote, Mrs. Billy Graham is quoted as saying, the Christian woman is most truly liberated. She can be liberated behind a sink full of dirty dishes or a load of dirty clothes. She's free to do what God has called her to do. One person frames this as white supremacist maternalism. This is a political bloc of women wanting to be the queens of the kingdom.
I was struck by how slippery it, I mean, intelligent but slippery, and created an argument that no one was actually having, exaggerated her opponent, and then made people fear the opponent. If some women got to work, then pretty soon there will be this cultural backlash, and no women will be able to stay at home if they want to. And isn't that bad?
Right.
It's like, what are you debating?
Right. Her voting bloc was church-going, rural and suburban women who had privileges to lose.
Now, we're going to voice act a debate that happened in 1973. William Buckley Jr. moderated this debate between Phyllis Schlafly and Anne London Scott, who was at the time a professor of English. They were debating the ERA. They were answering the question at this point of whether a wife had a legal right against her husband to demand support, like if he wasn't supporting them. So this is not divorce law or alimony law. It's within a marriage. That's the situation that they were talking about. And in 1973, it's also important to remember women could not get a credit card. Only in 1974 could women get credit cards. And Phyllis Schlafly seems to like that system. And she likes a marriage where a wife competes against her husband. And so I want you as our listeners to listen for the mistress of the manor privilege here. I will be voicing Anne Scott and William Buckley, and Haley will be voicing Phyllis Schlafly. The only way in which a woman can be assured of getting support is to bring either separation action or divorce action.
That's completely untrue.
Can't a woman present herself to a court and say that her husband is neglecting her and her children? When that happened in Nebraska, the court said that it had no obligation or right to make the man support the woman.
Well, let me tell you what happened when the wife did it in Illinois. In Illinois, the court said that the husband had to even buy her a fur coat, a beautiful silver mink coat. And he had that obligation to do it because it was his obligation to support her. Even though she had her own means, she had $10,000 income of her own. And even though she had 4 other coats. Now, this is the obligation of the husband, and these are our wonderful rights.
I would say that that settlement indicates that she had an excellent lawyer, whereas poor women do not have that kind of legal representation. And therefore, they're the ones who do not get supported with their children.
They do. They get it according to the husband's means. The wife does not have to go to court to get it. All she needs to do is go to any store and charge the bill to her husband. And in practice, the wife can get whatever she chooses to spend of her husband's money. The stores give her that credit because they know they can collect against him. The law gives them that right, and then it's between the store and the husband to fight about paying the bill. The wife does not have to go to court at all. It, I mean, it's such naked materialism and a privilege grab to say, and it's a little clip, and you can research and read more about her, and I get that we're clipping out a little piece, but to say these are our wonderful rights, our
Right.
wonderful privilege to get a fourth coat, a silver mink coat, to say nothing of like the grossness of older generations, like the fur coat being some sort of status something or another. Just, ugh.
Yeah. I mean, she's saying currently women or wives can compel their husbands to buy something she wants, and she could sue him if he
Right.
does. Like, is that really what you want to do? Uh,
Right. Is
those are
how could you have a marriage like that?
those are right. Those are rights.
Right. Right.
That's what
Later
you want to
on,
defend.
she says that a wife can go to any store and charge up her husband's account, and then the store has to go to the husband and be like, "Hey, you owe us money." And she's like, "We're going to lose these rights." What?
So you want to defend an adversarial marriage,
Right.
right? Like when it gets to the point that you're doing that,
Right.
those are the rights you want to defend. Okay.
One of the first things that the Equal Rights Amendment would do is to invalidate the state laws that make it the obligation of the husband to support his wife.
It fits in with Debi Pearl being like, earn every smile and shared moment, the tool of your warfare. Yeah, marriage is war for these women. They do not work well and love their husbands if you're talking about him as if he doesn't exist. Maybe I believe misandry is a thing in this case because but maybe I believe that no one knows how to love anybody in this case.
So our point is, how do women adjust themselves, contort themselves to fit into a Confucian system or a Confucian-like system, right? Like that we're saying plantation capitalism is that. We're saying, well, at least in its origins, American Christianity is that. What comes up to my mind is Elisabeth Elliot, who also recently passed away, 2015. But there was this article that it was examining how she changed across her lifetime regarding her views of women in ministry, women in marriage. And I thought this was really sad, because I grew up in the era where Elisabeth Elliot's writings were, highly regarded, read by everybody that I knew.
I know a lot of women my age who have read a lot of her. I haven't read anything. I've listened to one like really short talk by her just as research for this. So she doesn't hit any buttons for me, but I'm aware that she's there as a pretty significant influence. And I think it's very, very sad that there's this mythology built around Jim Elliot and Elisabeth Elliot. She barely knew him
Hmm.
relative to the amount of time that she lived. And there's no spotlight being shone on the man that she was married to for most of the time who abused her.
But what's interesting is that she was pretty outspoken as a woman for women when, in her first marriage to Jim Elliot. So, granting all that of what you said in this article by Liz Charlotte Grant says, she was an intellectual widow in her 30s who taught the Bible to both men and women, although it was controversial at the time for women to teach the Bible to men. She left her daughter at home with a friend to travel for her career, move freely amongst the New York City literati. She shared a literary agent with Robert Frost and Madeleine L'Engle, and openly expressed disdain at Christian publishing for habitually making stories neat and tidy. The early Elisabeth Elliot courted the ideas of feminism and gained a reputation as being argumentative and opinionated. But her second marriage to Addison Leach started to change her. He was an older conservative Presbyterian seminary professor who this biographer, Austin, describes as traditional, against questioning, and institutionalist to the core, who once said that the conversation around women's liberation is stupid. And she adjusted herself to that and then really changed when she married Lars Gren. Biographer Ellen Vaughn describes the logic of Eliot's third marriage like this. I could see Elizabeth's understandable loneliness, deep need for affirmation, physical hunger, physical hunger, weariness, and desire to be, quote, protected that gradually, insidiously led her step by cajoling step into a difficult third marriage that confined and controlled her for the rest of her long life. Elliot exchanged freedom for security. She became a person whose highest value was the desire to feel secure. Unfortunately, Gren had no safety to offer, and his presence only exacerbated Elliot's pain. His intentions became clear immediately, and Elliot later admitted to close friends that within hours of their wedding ceremony, she realized she'd made a mistake in marrying Gren. According to Austen's biography, when Elliot and Gren returned to their home to pick up their luggage, Gren refused to leave for their honeymoon until he was good and ready. Apparently, earlier that day, Elliot had guided the couple as they left the church sanctuary. She steered them the opposite direction that Gren was walking, causing their friends to chuckle. This supposed humiliation made Gren furious, and he reasserted his control. Gren's anger would define their 38-year relationship. Both biographers describe a dramatic curtailing of Elliot's freedom after her third marriage. Gren decided when she drank a cup of tea, took a bath, and when she slept. He frequently checked her car's odometer, double checking that she hadn't made any unplanned stops. He controlled the house thermostat. He listened in on her phone conversations and had the final say on whether she visited her friends, often declining invitations for her at the last minute. When he grew angry with his wife, he would refuse to speak to her for days. And most painful for Elliot, Gren unpredictably denied her access to the daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren she loved. The manipulations worsened as Elliot's husband took over management of the Elisabeth Elliot industry. The biographer Austen writes, he introduced her at the podium, adjusted her microphone, managed the book table, and made sure she ate. He decided when she rested and when she worked and when she socialized. He berated her for errors in speaking, even critiquing her posture. Gren kept up a grueling speaking schedule for the introverted Elliot, who often experienced nightmares about public speaking and would have preferred a retreat from public life in her later years. However, she submitted to Gren's relentless expectations, and so her influence continued to grow to her chagrin. Elliot maintained a whirlwind of speaking engagements long after her Alzheimer's diagnosis in the 1990s because of Gren. Even after she'd lost the ability to speak, at least once, Gren had her sit on stage smiling while Gren played a tape of a speech she'd recorded years earlier. Only when a doctor ordered the end of her travel did she find relief from her husband's demands. And the iron, I mean, that is just bitter on its own. But the content of her storytelling and such was about her first husband, right? Jim Elliot, and also her time as a missionary.
Right.
Meanwhile, she's just being absolutely controlled by Lars Gren. So now we're on Grazie Sophia Christie.
Yep. A couple weeks ago, maybe it wasn't that. I think it was a couple weeks ago. There was this article that came out in The Cut. I don't know how to say this girl's name. Gracie, I think that's what I'm going to call her. Grazie Sophia Christie. And she wrote this article about it's like the case for marrying an older man or something. It wasn't really a case for marrying an older man. It's a case for marrying a rich man. It's what it is. But
right.
He's technically older too, and you know she got sort of skewered a little bit by the internet, and then the buzz died down. But
yeah, rightly so. Let's, for those who haven't read the article, we'll put it in the notes and stuff. But what grabbed your attention, Haley?
um, I have some quotes here, and I think that they hit at this theme of women feeling like that they need to be this queen, and that it comes out. We're going to put all these things together, like the grandiosity, the inadequacy you feel at not being the same as a man, all of this. She says, I used to love men like men love women. That is not very well, and with a hunger driven only by my own inadequacies. And then she says, mainly I spotted the precise trouble of being a woman ahead of time, tried to surf it instead of letting it drown me on principle. I had grown bored of discussions of fair and unfair, equal or unequal, and preferred instead to consider a thing called ease, which is really giving I need a fourth fur coat. She's truly, the daughter of Phyllis Schlafly and those who
It,
came, whoever came before and since her.
right.
I mean, there's another piece of this where she's a writer, and so she lives with him, she moves in with him, and he sort of takes care of everything for her. I mean, she's a kept woman in some way. She says ambitious, hungry. He needed someone smart enough to sustain his interests, but flexible enough in her habits to build them around his hours. There's no equality between the king and queen here, right? I do read myself occupied, make myself free, materialize beside him when he calls for me. In exchange, I left a lucrative but deadening spreadsheet job to write full time without having to live like a writer. I learned to cook a little and decorate somewhat poorly. Mostly, I get to read and walk central London and Miami and think in delicious circles, to work hard when necessary for free, and write stories for far less than minimum wage when I tally all the hours I take to write them. She also says, my husband struck me instead as so finished, formed, analyzable for compatibility. He bore the traces of other women who'd improved him, small but crucial basics like use a coaster. Listen, don't give advice. Young egos mellow into patience and generosity. He wasn't that much older. She's making it sound like he's 50. He's 30. Like, please, everybody, summon the visage of a 30-year-old man in your head and think if their young egos have mellowed into patience and generosity. But I digress.
I guess everyone should have a really flexible career.
Yeah, that would be nice for lots of people. I would absolutely endure walking around central London thinking in delicious circles and hanging out in Miami whenever I like and writing for less than minimum wage because that is the kind of life I would love. But she says, my husband isn't my partner. What? What? But she goes on, he's my mentor, my lover, and only in certain contexts, my friend. I'll never forget it, how he showed me around our first place, like he was introducing me to myself. This is the wine you'll drink, where you'll keep your clothes. We vacation here. This is the other language we'll speak. You'll learn it. I did.
Right, because he's French. Yeah.
Right. Adulthood seemed a series of exhausting obligations, but his logistics ran so smoothly that he simply tacked mine on. I moved into his flat, onto his level, drag and drop, cleaner thrice a week, bills automatic. Oh, that's nice. Bills automatic. By opting out of partnership in my 20s, I granted myself a kind of compartmentalized, liberated selfishness none of my friends have managed. I am the work in progress, the party we worry about, a surprising dominance. And she talks about how much, sort of how dumb she is in contrast to him. And she's just young and, he's a little older and he's got a job and she, molded her life around him so she didn't have one. And then she sort of talks about her friend who has a boyfriend that's the same age, and they're both ambitious and close and trying to, go through the world together. But she says that neither had any advice to give each other and certainly no stability. I pictured a three-legged race, two people tied together, hobbling toward every milestone. It's so distressing and so sad to think that assuming a subservient queen role in a tiny little kingdom is going to bring you happiness when there's obviously an undertone of competition in all of this. She's just given into it. This is not
Yeah.
happiness. She says, I don't fool myself. My marriage has its cons. Well, thank goodness that you know some of them. There are only so many times one can say thank you for splendid scenes, fine dinners, before the phrase starts to grate. I live in an apartment whose rent he pays and that shapes the freedom with which I can never be angry with him.
Wait. So, like, I thought she did want the fur coats, but now she doesn't. I'm just kidding. It is a weird trade-off.
Right. To have to saying thank you is good, but this is strange. He doesn't have to hold it over my head. It just floats there, complicating usual shorthands to explain dissatisfaction like, you aren't being supportive lately. It's a Frenchism to say, take a decision. And from time to time, I joke, from whom? Occasionally, this is the saddest part for me, by the way. Occasionally, I find myself in some fabulous country at some fabulous party, and I think, what a long way I've traveled, like a lucky cloud, and it is frightening to think of oneself as vapor. This is a description of stress and fear-induced dissociation, a form of it. She's so unbalanced and unhappy that she is not able to be in her body in these fancy parties in fancy countries.
Yeah, like she's using the passive voice. Her mind catches up to her body every once in a while.
Right. This isn't the language of partnership or equality between a man and a woman. And certainly you can't take this forward to our partnership with all of our brothers and sisters in the world amongst humanity generally. She says she doesn't even want or expect or aim for partnership. She denigrates her friend's relationship of equals and looks down on that. She is a daughter of Phyllis Schlafly's movement. She's afraid, but she can't even feel it except around the edges when the stress leaks in at a fancy party. She disdains equality.
This is what she's done to adjust herself to the hierarchy. Yeah. And so the paper about Korean women impacted by Confucianism is that paradoxical language, which does make sense, but it's grandiosity, but also low self-esteem. I mean, maybe in alternating doses.
Right. That's what she has there because she's like, well, I'm better than my friend because my boyfriend's old and rich. But she can't feel all the way happy about it. I just think of the lyrics of that song, What Was I Made For? I'll read some of them because it really makes me think of her. When did it end? All the enjoyment. I'm sad again. Don't tell my boyfriend. It's not what he's made for. What was I made for? I don't know how to feel, but I want to try. I don't know how to feel. Someday I might. Think I forgot how to be happy. It's something I'm not. Something I can be. Something I wait for. Something I'm made for. These women can't feel happy. You can't feel happy if all you're doing is competing with your husband. You were not made for this.
Or doing everything to not compete with your husband, like, or kind of mold yourself around everything he is so that you can take up the rest of the space.
I think it's fooling oneself if you enter into a hierarchical, combative sort of war-based system and think that I'm just going to lie down and take it and that's how I'm going to cope. I don't actually think that's possible. I think you have to have partnership and you have to move in the direction of fighting to have equality and partnership, or you're going to be pulled into this paradigm of like, fight for yourself. You're fighting against the mythical secretary, or you're fighting your husband for a fourth fur coat, or you're like, oh, I guess I'm just so stupid. And then you're dissociated at a fancy party. None of it works. None of it is what Christ wants for us.
But again, I think it's important to tie history into this. We had discussed a book by Stephanie Jones Rogers, who talks about white women as slave owners in the American South. It's a book called They Were Her Property. The way those white women fit into the racial hierarchy of the plantation system under their husbands, right, was they exercised power over Black women. They arranged for Black women to give birth at the same time, to steal their labor, to steal their nutrients from her so she could breastfeed the white woman's child. You want to live a life of ease however you can get it.
Right.
Well, let's just save myself some breastfeeding.
Right.
But in order to do that, I'm going to set it up so that my husband is raping the black woman in our household.
Right. It's cruel beyond imagination. One reviewer of this book says, if their husbands proved unsatisfactory slave owners in their eyes, the women might petition for the right to manage their property themselves, which they did with imaginative sadism. And it is the imaginative sadism that comes through in historical accounts of white women as slave masters. So yeah, you can be the queen of the plantation, you can be the number two, you can be the assistant to the manager of the plantation.
So everyone, including the women, are in on the sexual abuse of other women.
Right.
That is horrifying.
Right. Right. In the good old days and the good old Mad Men days when, men were men and women were women, and it was, I don't know, Leave It to Beaver or something. Like, were women of color ever able to live those lives in those times, or were they busy taking care of white women's children and houses while the white women were drugged out on amphetamines, taking uppers to wake up and do the work and downers to go back to sleep?
Wait, how do we know that?
Well, we have research because here's a quote. In amphetamine alone in the United States in the early 1960s, people were using nearly as much psychotropic medication as the 65 doses per person per year in the present decade that social critics find so extraordinary. And men were exposed to amphetamines too, by the way, via military service where drugs were given by officers. So after war, this hierarchy requires active, energetic worker bees to keep the war machine going. So yeah, people in the good old days had to be drugged up to go to war to kill other people, and the women had to be drugged up to get through their everyday lives. And meanwhile, there were other people doing the housework and taking care of the children.
Well, that continues the trend from the 1930s, where you go find on the store shelf Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which is for your children if you wanted your children to go to sleep. But what was in it? Opium, which came from Latin America.
Right.
And who used it, right? Like these working class parents who were so exhausted, they would use morphine and alcohol syrup to make their children sleep.
Right.
I mean, wow, this is what capitalism does to us.
Right. And I would want to say to all of the women raising children and exhausted because their babies won't sleep, their children won't sleep. Oh, my darling, do not worry when your grandmother shames you because her babies just slept. She gave them opium. Don't worry about it.
Oh, man.
You're doing okay. You didn't give your kids opium.
Right. So is parenting harder today? Well,
It's a bit
we're
hard.
trying not to take as many shortcuts.
You can't give your kids opium so you can like knock them out pharmacologically at night. It's a bit harder. Yes.
It was hard for women in the 1950s all the way to today. And it's hard for men as well. Bell Hooks has a book called The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, which talks about, does anyone care about the inner lives of men?
Right.
And Bell Hooks says, no.
Right.
Here's a quote. The unhappiness of men in relationships, the grief men feel about the failure of love, often goes unnoticed in our society precisely because patriarchal culture really does not care if men are unhappy.
Right. I was just chatting with somebody else in my profession, and they were saying that, men typically are not, but really need to be emotionally online. The emotions that they have is they're angry and they have a lot of happiness when the sports thing happens, so they get sports joy, but they don't really have any insight into what's wrong with them. And this person said, I think it's so astute. Is it possible that all of your other emotions got shamed out of you?
Ooh, like it's just not manly to show those emotions,
Yeah,
to have the full human expression of emotion.
right.
Wow. And yet, for our listeners, here's why it's so important that we discuss these issues, because Kjirsten Kobus-Dumay writes about Project 2025, which the Trump campaign has basically adopted. It comes from the Heritage Foundation, the conservative group, and the Society for American Civic Renewal. the acronym is SACR, SACR, and that's actually how its members and participants call it, SACR. And Kjirsten Dumais says this: the Trove reveals SACR's core mission to create a mini-state within a state, composed entirely of Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian men. It's explicitly patriarchal, demanding that group members assume a dominant role at home. Remember John Winthrop and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right? I mean, the use of Christian faith and the twisting of it to create mini states within a larger state. That's the goal of Confucianism. That's the goal of plantation capitalism, right? To do what? It says, and celebrates the use of force and existence of authority. Amid all the hearkening back to the founding fathers, America's first principles and patriotism, there are few mentions of democracy in the materials we reviewed. Wow.
Of course, you don't need democracy because it's just a bunch of mini authoritarian states culminating in one massive authoritarian state. We don't need to hear what the little people think about us.
Right.
That actually would be at cross purposes with an authoritarian series of mini city states culminating in a big one.
Right. And of course, it is to exploit people and planet all the way up and down the chain.
Absolutely.
So their agenda of cut back on taxes, regulation, no social supports, make the family pick up all the slack, make poor people pick up all the slack.
Cutting back on regulation. That has worked so well in the airline industry. I love this. You get on a plane, you're like, is this door gonna stay on? I love no regulations.
So much peace of mind.
Yeah. If you're a Boeing executive, I guess.
It's a lot like being that group of 10 male investors in England in the 1620s. How do we get people, to take these risks? They could lose their lives. Well, we'll sell them. You can be king of your own castle, queen under the king of the castle. This is a church growth strategy and a political strategy to attract men into the platform at the expense of women.
Right.
What it is.
Right. It's offering power, money, mainly power, and it doesn't care about women. It doesn't care about anybody who's vulnerable, even their own children.
And with that, let's talk about the biblical order of the family.
Yay.
According
Are we going
to
talk about some umbrellas now?
Bill Gothard's umbrella. Yes.
Yeah.
So here on the screen is this diagram of umbrellas under umbrellas.
Rain doesn't come from under the umbrellas. Everyone could be under Christ and you would be fine. These are
don't mess with don't insert logic into this, Haley. I mean, just make the outside world so threatening you will accept the hierarchy.
And I won't from within. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, exactly. And so no remedies for the threats from within. So you've got, of course, Christ as the big umbrella up top, the husband underneath, and it says protect the family. This is his job. Protect the family, lead the family, provide for the family. Underneath him is the wife, comfort, teach, and nurture. And then underneath the wife, children, whose duties are to love parents and obey parents. This is the idea of that we're calling, that I just find is very similar to the Confucian understanding of family and society, right? Every family is like a mini state.
This kind of reminds me of like the mafia. As long as you pay me, I won't punch you.
Right.
Like, I think you're a threat. You're not protecting me.
Right. They're selling protection. Protection from what? Protection from what I'll do to you if you don't pay me. Doesn't that sound a lot like penal substitutionary atonement?
Oh, it does.
Right. Just pay me with your life. For what? Protection. Protection from what? Protection from what I'm going to do to you if you don't pay me. So, well, gosh.
It's a fundamentally evil God who would say, hey guys, don't you all hate being in danger? We're like, definitely. And it's like, well, I'm really mean and I'll be mean to people. You're like, that's bad and scary. He's like, no. If you accept this payment, do this weird legal thing, then I will protect you from all the meanies and from myself. How about that? And then I'd be like, no, I don't want that. And everybody else is like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you want that? You don't want to be protected? And I'm like, yes, but okay.
Right. The premise is wrong.
Right.
So we've we've done that video before.
Right. We have. Go back and
But
watch that.
Haley, you showed me this song of the umbrella protection. I can't believe that this even exists.
When the sky grows dark and the thunder roars, when the strong winds blow and the cloud burst pours, I know I'm safe as I can be, when I'm under the umbrellas and the faces over me. For instruction, so I know where I belong, for correction, so I know when I am wrong, for provision, for the things I need, for protection that is guaranteed. When the sky grows dark and the thunder roars, when the strong winds blow and the cloud burst pours, I know I'm safe as I can be, when I'm under the umbrellas and the places over me.
Wow. Oh gosh.
Just knowing everything we know about the view of God as someone who you need to be protected from, and good news, he'll protect you from him, with
Right.
these little baby voices singing it, is gross.
Right.
This doesn't lead to a healthy attachment. And by the way, Bill Gothard of the IBLP is a sexual predator. The enemy was within the whole time.
Within the umbrella.
Right. It's
Right.
not like under the umbrella. Watch out, because there's dangerous people in here too. It's like, oh, as long as you stay here, stay very still and don't do anything, and we'll protect you from those on the outside. It's like, but what if you're bad? There's just fundamentally no paradigm for that.
Well, I mean, I think then we got to show this diagram, right? Like where every family in a Christian kind of church community and the congregation is under a male pastor who is under Christ, right? So you get Confucian dynamics in that direction.
Right.
And I guess, there are some, let's say, Christian nationalists who see this as a temporary thing until they can take over society.
Right.
I know for our listeners, there's all kinds of questions you're asking. Well, how do you read Ephesians 5 and the head-body relationship between husbands and wives? How do you read 1 Timothy in terms of male leadership or female leadership as well in the church?
Right.
We'll cover that in future sessions of this topic. But remember that the Virginia Company and the Massachusetts Bay Company were for-profit corporations. This was the introduction of English or white Christianity on North American soil. These are some of the foundational things that we inherit from white evangelicalism. They raised money from English investors who helped finance these settlements, and those investors expected money in return. They expected a higher return on their investment. And so for that reason, they injected into the cultural, legal, and institutional history of the U.S. privileges of male labor and male power. Mm-hmm. Women could adjust themselves to fit into that, but fundamentally, it was not Christian. They used Christian language and ideas, but it was not Christian to do this. And we will explain how to understand Scripture in light of all of this.
Well, that's all we have time for today, but join us next time for session 12, part 2, Confessions of a Former Confucian Christian Husband.